So you'll see that my presentation title, per custom, has changed slightly from what was originally suggested. But without further ado, I'll start reading my paper. So the principle of equality is often considered the founding universal principle of law. We are taught that Madam Justice is blind and that for this reason her judgment cannot be biased by people's appearance, gender, class, ethnicity, skin color, age, etc. She merely weighs the evidence provided to come to her judgment. But is it really this simple? For years, critical scholars have pointed to the ways in which the real-life workings of criminal justice systems produce skewed outcomes along gendered, class, and racialized lines. In most prisons around the world, males, lower income, and racial and ethnic minorities are overrepresented. This relates to the fact that institutions that make up this system, the police, the prisons, the courts, are governance institutions with colonial legacies, aimed at the maintenance and reproduction of social order. In other words, at controlling capital O others, criminals, dissidents, migrant and Black and brown populations, with the side effect of reducing all to the former, the criminal, intentionally or not. Once we decide to see color, to acknowledge the different ways in which national projects and discourses of inclusion and exclusion feed the continued dominance of white or whiter man, it is difficult to ignore the color disparities that the carceral systems produce. Yet in the analysis of the workings of contemporary Latin American and European criminal justice systems, attention to, in particular, the racialized dynamics at play has been scarce. Drawing on my research at the carceral margins in both Nicaragua and the Netherlands, I aim to explore here how both systems structurally reproduce racialized inequalities across space, even though they both actively deny the relevance of race. And Black Nicaraguan scholars have pointed out the denial of race through Nicaragua's majority mestizo nationalist politics. Beyond the left-right divide, mestizo nationalism works to elevate the status of mixed-race Nicaraguans and those of white European descent, naturalizing their dominance in the political arena. And if the goal is a mestizo nation, it is also the dissolution of Black and indigenous populations in the process, through mixture, through whitening. This is a Latin American phenomenon not limited to Nicaragua. Brazilian sociologist João Costa Vargas has argued, for instance, that the ideology of mestizaje and its Brazilian counterpart, racial democracy, has produced both an ingrained negation of race, and therefore racism, and a hyper-consciousness of color, and therefore colorism. While the right wing has more clearly embraced this Christian white supremacist logic of things, Latin American socialist politics over the past 60-odd years have not helped overcome this paradox either. Generally fixated on the class struggle, they have by and large ignored racialized dynamics underpinning class divisions, denying the racialized experiences of the lower class, and in some cases even deeming ethnic difference to stand in the way of class-based organization. Interestingly, Dutch Surinamese anthropologist Gloria Wekker would point out for the Netherlands that the legacy of the Second World War produced a similar paradox around the negation of racial experience and the assimilation of Dutch colonial history and its legacies here. Being quote-unquote colorblind would be better, with the intention of combating racism, but the side effect of here too ignoring the lived realities of racialized groups. Acknowledging this, however, also means seeing whiteness. As one of my research participants in Amsterdam put it, het systeem is wit, the system is white. It is well-educated white people making life-changing decisions for Ahmed Clifton or Henk with the alcoholic dad, he continued, without ever having really interacted with them in their lives. So there's principle of equality embedded in the law, but we aren't really seen as equal, are we? When looking closely at policing and sentencing practices in the Netherlands, a particular pattern emerges that increases the likelihood of non-white Dutch citizens to end up on the more punitive side of our criminal justice system. In the process, institutions make decisions not simply based on a criminal offense, but on what are considered risk factors that impact the perceived governability of the detained person. And this is where particular cultural behaviors and environments are constructed as adverse to our normative framework and to societal security, veiligheid in Dutch. Once such adverse behaviors have been institutionally diagnosed, so to speak, care or zorg comes into play. Now, with the very best intentions, treatment plans and family interventions are drawn up, accompanied by, admittedly often needed, coaching and mental support. Yet with care and security, zorg and veiligheid, the paradigms of penal welfarism and neoliberal control begin to merge. Risk and responsibility are individuated, and white institutions know better than their non-white residents what's best for them. But how does one begin to look at incarceration as a racialized endeavor in a country that actively negates the relevance or even existence of racial experience? How do notions about the governability of othered populations reproduce inequality? We need but look at the tax agency scandal revealing the wrongful targeting of thousands of non-Dutch families for tax fraud, or the different reception arrangements for white Ukrainian refugees as opposed to Black and brown African, Arab, and Latino refugees, to understand how racialized governance operates. Yet with the best of intentions and a healthy dose of white innocence, as Claudia Becker says, we brush over or reduce to administrative flaws the systemically unequal treatment of non-white others. The law is constructed as universal, neutral even, and decision-making processes in the courtroom and the prison system are projected to be void of color-based considerations. Yet when we look closer at both the outcomes and lived experiences of the system, this is not the case. The majority of our prison population is non-white, or speaking in the colorblind terms of our Bureau for Demographic Statistics, of a non-Western migration background, first or second generation, with one or both parents from abroad. And let's be clear, this is not because non-white populations commit more crimes, as certain right-wing politicians would like us to see it, but because they are more likely to be paid less and live in low-income neighborhoods, which because of their socioeconomic and largely non-white buildup, tend to be under stricter police control. They tend to be perceived as dangerous, nuisances, or suspicious when outside their neighborhood. And this way, they are more likely to be subject to ethnic profiling. And once arrested, they are more likely to be held on remand awaiting trial. And once on remand, they're more likely to be sentenced to prison time by the judge rather than a fine or a community sentence, and much more likely to be handed tougher sentences without parole. Overall, once people have served prison time, the likelihood of being sentenced to prison again if arrested increases exponentially, while this is not the case for those who have previously paid fines or completed community service. In all, a cycle or carceral circuit emerges that disproportionately pulls young Black and brown men into the system. On top of this, an increasing amount of institutions believe intervening at ever earlier ages will help prevent crime, without taking into account the ways in which this perpetuates and expands the control mechanisms in place. Interestingly, within this panorama, I've included a sketch that I made just the other week with my research assistant as we're trying to come to a close on the data collection phase of this Amsterdam-based project. The judges tend to construct prison as a positive intervention to help people back on track, to provide them with the care they need or with a space for reflection. By interpreting subjects' behavior, they look for signs of educability, or as one of the judges in our study said, if there's still music in him, in virtue of reaching lighter verdicts. Be a good carceral subject and you'll come out better, is the slogan, sort of, among judges. In the meantime, care providers line up to iron out the creases, adjust and tweak and shave, while inserting themselves as a buffer between the incarcerated and the system. A buffer that has become so institutionalized that it is almost indistinguishable from the system itself. So to wrap up, so much effort on part of professionals and policymakers and institutions of all sorts to touch the life worlds of young law-breaking men in order to fix them. But so little critical reflection on the ways in which such interventions reproduce spatial inequality, urban, spatial, and ethnic inequalities, on the normative paradigms from which they are created, and the effects they end up having. If we don't begin seeing the colored contours of the supposedly neutral policies that are drawn up, then how can we begin addressing institutional racism? How can we begin to provide quote-unquote solutions if we do not even acknowledge people's racialized experiences? In the Netherlands, we love to see ourselves as one of the frontrunners of progressive and non-punitive sentencing, just because our prison population has been decreasing over the past years, and because we use short sentences. But there is an absolute disregard of the inequalities that this system reproduces, and particularly the racial disparities that it manifests. Asking the other question, as Mari Matsuda proposed, which is the uncomfortable question, allows us to point to the inequalities that our system produces beyond its good intentions of progressive penal practice. And I believe that only in this way we can begin to point to deconstructing that system bit by bit. Thank you.
Well, you can just start wrapping up before. Sure. I just lost it. Thank you so much for that, Julienne. That was yeah, such an interesting presentation on those intersections of policing and race and comparison, yeah, between Nicaragua. Thank you for that. We'll open up to questions now. So I can't think of anything on the chat, but does anyone firstly in the room have any questions for Julienne? I might start. I guess I just had a question around care. Like you mentioned care a few times, like that judges thought that sending ethnic minorities to prison would be a form of care and they could be reformed. And I guess I was just wondering, you know, how do you think your interview participants conceptualize care, and then how did you as the researcher, how do you think of care, I guess, in comparison or in relation?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and something that I haven't really started to, yeah, I guess, I mean, so in terms of conceptualization, we're really at the start. What's coming out of the data now is this tension between institutions that are supposedly of security, so police, for instance, and then the institutions that are supposedly of care. So what these institutions themselves indicate, so we've spoken with a lot of institutional actors as well, is that they don't speak each other's language, that there's a language of security and there's a language of care, and that it entails approaching people differently. One is the security paradigm is mostly from the idea that the society needs to be protected from people, so people should be excluded, and the care paradigm says we need to protect the person who is being excluded, and we have to kind of ready them for return to society. So there's in my perception, there's also a mutuality, as in the exclusion itself is not produced by either of the actors as something unnatural. It's kind of, by both of them, it's seen as a necessary ill, while, let's say, with a different kind of who it is protecting. So is it protecting the suspect, or is it protecting the society? And then there's a big conflation of care with forensic care. So with specifically kind of attaching a mandatory therapy or these kinds of interventions to somebody's sentence. So the judge kind of using the availability of therapies within the institutional environment, within the criminal justice system, as a reason to say this person is better placed inside prison than on a community sentence because they need a particular form of care. And if they were to follow that outside of prison, there is a lesser likelihood that they would actually attend. So it's kind of a way in which they try to force a care therapy onto people who they think need it. And that is especially if it's, and that's where I kind of draw in the critical racialized perspective, is that it's especially when they are seen as not complying with normative, Dutch, quote unquote, so let's say white Dutch norms. And if they are not, so it reproduces kind of anti-Muslim or anti-Black sentiments. So that's, I don't know, I'm not yet ready to say more theoretically about what that then does with care, but what I feel is that it produces a very carceral notion of care as very much imbricated within this system of control.
Oh, thanks for that. No, that was very helpful. So it sounds like care very much wrapped up still in those different institutional contexts and forms of incarceration. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Any questions from the room?
I have a short question. I don't know if there's someone in the room that wants to speak.
No, go for it.
Okay, well, it's a short question, really. I was wondering, it's the concept of care, the one that's central in imprisonment, and not rehabilitation or something similar, like it has changed, because you said that it's care for first intervention, which for me it reminds about rehabilitation. So there's a relationship between those concepts. It's rehabilitation not talked about anymore, or?
No, so I'm an anthropologist, so I try to use as closely as possible the emic terms, and care. So zorg is literally care, and that's what you could see during the slides, also on the posters of particular intervention teams. So that, say handled with care. So kind of you're using care to handle people. And it's not related to the obviously it's related to the welfarist rehabilitational paradigm if we look at it through the lens of penology. But the word that is used is care. And zorg is also our word for mental health care and for regular health care. So it's also kind of a container category for different forms of care. Institutional care. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Julienne. We might move on, but thank you for that great presentation. And if we have time after, we might return to discussion. But up now we have Cristina Güerri, who will be speaking on prison officers, social support, and an exercise of power in Spanish prisons. So yes, take the lead.
Oh, 1 second. Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Then I will start. Okay, I'm Cristina Güerri. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at Universidad de Málaga, and today I'm going to present part of my doctoral research in which I explored the role of prison officers in Spanish prisons. The paper I'm presenting here focuses on one of the roles I explored, that is prison officers' provision of social support, which I define, as you can see here, following Cullen, as prison officers' delivery of practical or emotional assistance to inmates. Not many studies in the carceral context use the concept of social support to talk about this assistance of officers to inmates. There are a few examples that are the ones that you can see cited here, and it's generally more used the concept of human service in the US, especially, or care in the UK or other countries. But I think that that talking about social support provides a better conceptual framework to analyze some issues related to this assistance. So in many contexts, the role of the prison officer is associated mainly with the primary tasks of keeping control, maintaining order within the prison. But previous research in many contexts has shown that they also perform human service or supportive tasks that are related to the bureaucratic nature or to the domestic nature of prison, in the sense that as inmates are confined within the prison, they have some needs that need to be attended. And as the prison is a bureaucratic institution, sometimes it's also difficult to deal with these issues without the help of or assistance of others. So, for example, on a regular day, prison officers may provide help making sure that inmates have covered the needs for goods and services they have, like, for example, making sure that they have lunch or dinner, which would be, or, for example, giving them access to the cell when they are out, which would be forms of practical support. Or they can also talk to them and listen to their problems, which would be a form of emotional support. So the first question I had was if that's the case in Spain. There was no research about prison officers in Spain prior to my work. So it was a question I had, like, it's that part of Spanish prison reality. And well, that's an important issue because according to literature, the provision of social support is very important because it contributes to the well-being and adjustment of inmates to prison. And that's the reason why in many countries, human service or caring activities, whatever they are called, are increasingly encouraged. So it helps the achievement of institutional goals. However, if we look at the literature, we can also see that the involvement of prison officers in these tasks varies. So generally, there are two typologies of prison officers that are found. Some of them are more involved in custodial issues, while others are more human service oriented and tend to help inmates more. Also, this conflict between providing care or making sure that inmates don't escape and that there is order may make this task a bit conflicted. And also it has been shown that some officers said that they don't feel supported by management when they perform these tasks, and also that sometimes they may face hostility by colleagues. So seeing that it's a discretional task to some extent in many contexts, that it's a conflicted task and that it's not rewarded and sometimes it's met with hostility. A second relevant question is, if prison officers provide social support to inmates, why are they doing that? So these are the two main questions that I had. Here you have some data just to give context on what I looked at in Spanish prisons. Prison officers are on a ratio of 3 inmates per prison officer, more or less. In practice, it's less, but it's a very big part of the prison workers. They are a big part of the prison workers. 1 out of 4 are women and 1 out of 2 are older than 50 years. And more importantly, the assigned tasks according to prison law are mainly security and helping to the success of treatment programs, but they are also told about having to provide for inmates' needs and making sure that the wing looks smoothly. That's all that says on the law about this provision of support or assistance, just making sure that they have lunch and their basic needs and that there are no problems of the wing, on the wing, like making the wing work. To explore the 2 questions I mentioned, I used, my approach was qualitative. I interviewed 40 prison officers in 2 prisons. I wanted to do some non-participant observation, but was only allowed in 1 of the prisons. And I targeted for the sample only prison officers that work in residential units, which means that they had direct contact with inmates on a daily basis. I will start by to explain the results. So I started all the interviews with a general question: what is your role, your main role as a prison officer? And most participants obviously talked about maintaining security in prison, 34 out of 14. But I was surprised that almost half of them also mentioned tasks and explained me examples related to providing for inmates' needs. So, for example, here you can see that this first person describes assistance to inmates as processing the bureaucratic. So, for example, for asking for everything, inmates need to fill forms, and prison officers have to process these forms. So some people talked about helping inmates in this sense, the basic bureaucratic tasks, or just giving this basic service that the law said that they had to give. But also there were some of them that gave a more broad depiction of this assistance. So as in this case, he put as an example that they had he had helped an inmate write an illiterate inmate to write a letter to his wife, or he also tells about listening to inmates' problems. So it depicts a broad conception of social support in which not only the most basic tasks are carried out, but also some things that imply going out of their way to help inmates. So when I asked about the kinds of help they provided, I was given many examples. Only when I asked specifically about that, only 2 said that they never helped inmates, and the other ones put many examples that related both to practical and emotional support. I won't expand on that, but they were examples such as the one I just told you, sometimes helping to arrange meetings with the family, or helping them to check their bank account, these kinds of things that they didn't have to do, but they did. In fact, it was interesting that many of them put emphasis on this issue, that they helped inmates even when it was not their duty, beyond what it was required to them, and they did it because they wanted to. This is an important thing because it stresses that it's something discretional, also in the Spanish context. And I also had examples of some prison officers saying that they didn't feel supported by management to perform these tasks, and that sometimes their colleagues would mock them or treat them with hostility. So, for example, one said that he was called the priest because he spent too much time listening to inmates, or one criticized other of his colleagues, saying that they did dances with wolves, like saying they spent too much time with inmates. So these issues that we could see in the literature about being a discretional task, sometimes met with hostility and not supported, are also true in the Spanish context. So the other question about why do prison officers provide support, it's also worth asking in the Spanish context. So when I analyzed the interviews to try to have some light on this issue, I saw that there were two main reasons to help inmates. So first, for some officers, mainly prison officers, providing this help had an intrinsic value. These officers tended to see the prisoners as confined persons and not as sentenced criminals, and this allowed them to have institutional empathy. And they tried to convey that to me on many occasions, like they tried to explain to me the privations that prison life imposes to inmates, and explain me that they are limited to solve most of these issues on their own. So sometimes they would help them just because they could. Like if an inmate has forgotten something in the cell, they cannot return because it's closed. They need a prison officer that opens it for them, and that's not something that prison officers are obliged to do. So this was for the officers who understood that they found meaning in giving this help. But I could also see that in most discourses, both the issues of providing social support and keeping order were related. So, for example, one of the questions in the interview was what's the most important thing for you to keep order in prison? And they, 1 out of 5 said something related to the provision of social support. It was important to keep order. And also when they were giving me examples of the assistance they were giving to inmates, you could always see how their explanations were always related to order. So the relationship between social support and order, it was produced by mainly 3 mechanisms. I will explain it very quickly because I don't have much time, but one of the first issues was to prevent the appearance of conflict. Some prison officers thought about inmates with problems as time bombs that needed to be defused. They understood that if they had problems, they had very few ways to deal with them. And sometimes they needed to help inmates so they could stay calm. And so it was a way of, it could be understood as dynamic security, because they, by knowing inmates, but getting to know inmates, they could help them and try to prevent conflicts. So in certain ways, the social support is a way to provide coping assistance that lessens the effect of these criminogenic strains that may give problems, may create problems in prison. A second clear association was that social support was an incentive to foster good behavior, or a way to gain reciprocity. In many cases, they said when I help them, they say thank you, Mr. Perez, and the officer saying, and I say no, thank you. That's a favor. You owe me one. So it was a way to, or as in this example, as she said, I'm not helping you because you do not behave. If you behave correctly, I will help you. So it was also clear how practical support was conditioned to good behavior within prison to gain this instrumental control. And finally, the third mechanism was to build personal authority. So helping inmates was a way to show them that they used their power fairly, and therefore they could be respected by inmates. So they had a certain normative control, in the sense that if they would ask for things, inmates would comply because they respect the prison officer. So to wrap up, this paper is important in the Spanish context because it shows that prison officers provide practical as well and emotional support to inmates. But also it's important to take into account that even if security and care or social support, as I use the concept, seem to be conflicted tasks, they can also be complementary. So the provision of social support can help to maintain order in prison, which in the end is the main task for prison officers. So it's understandable that they put a lot of emphasis in keeping order. And well, the final reflection, I won't expand on that, but it's that even if it's undeniable that the maintenance of order plays an important role in prison officers' willingness to provide social support, which would in some way pervert like the meaning of social support, we have to take into account that prison officers need to keep order in prison, and they could do that by more custodial ways, more with control tactics, but also they can use this social support. So I think that it's a good thing that they value that social support is good for keeping order, because it allows us to think about the construction of a supportive social order within the prison. So that would be for my closing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Cristina. That was great. It really great to get some insight into the Spanish system, and I thought it also had some interesting interconnections with a film we watched in the plenary last night, which looked at the roles of people working inside those systems. I'm just wondering if there are any questions in the room to begin. Yep.
Hi, thank you for that. I'm not sure if this is maybe slightly out of the scope of your research, but recently in the work that I'm doing with my colleague over here, we were discussing with people who had been in prison about their experiences, and something that came up with a few people was that they would do basically whatever they could to avoid having interactions with staff in prison. And if that meant not getting help, then they would choose not getting help over having to rely on someone. And I'm just wondering if that came up at all, and if corrections staff are the only or a primary source of support for people in Spanish prisons, then what impacts that has, or what effects that has, if that makes sense.
Okay, so that's like one of the limitations of this research, because I take the perspective of the prison officers. So I focus on the perspective of the delivery of social support and not of how this social support is perceived. I can only have their perspective. I know that that's one of the limitations. In fact, there's some research that I think that it was carried out in Australia showing that prison officers tend to believe that they help inmates more than they do. But that when the kinds of help that they describe, they are matched with what inmates describe as help that they are receiving by prison officers. So in this sense, I think that the kinds of help they are describing, they are real. Obviously, they may think that they are more helpful than they are. And also, yeah, related to that, that was one of the reasons what I wanted to do non-participant observation, to observe the real interactions between them, especially because depending on the architecture, it's much easier for inmates to reach prison officers, and depending on the kinds of prison, it varies a lot. Prison officers were telling me that, but I couldn't because I was only allowed to do that in one prison, and so it was really difficult. But yeah, that's an aspect that I take into account. And but anyways, given how Spanish prison works, as I said, there are some things that inmates need that they can only get through prison officers, because the prison is very bureaucratic. And for example, inmates cannot check their bank account in their own. They have to fill a form and wait maybe for 2 days, so they have the information they want. But prison officers can provide this help by checking it on the computer in a second. So some inmates will reach officers to get these kinds of help, like practical help in many things. And also it works the other way around. As I said, when they want to prevent conflict, if they know an inmate and know that he had a visit with his family that day, but he's sad, they think, okay, so maybe something happened and I need to know what happened, because it maybe, if not, it may be a problem in the future. So these interactions happen. I don't know to what extent, because I couldn't do the participant observation. And yeah, and also related to the presentation before, I'm also aware that there may be a lot of differences between Spanish nationals and people from other countries, which are not from Latin American countries, because of the language issue. It's very difficult to ask for help when you don't know the language, and maybe especially if you don't trust the prison officers. So yeah, these are issues that are important. And this was a very good question, because it's something that it needs to be again taken into account.
Any other questions from the room? Yeah.
Yeah, I need to be on.
Anyway, thank you. That was a really interesting paper. I'm interested in definitions or shared understandings of the word duty, and whether there's a role that cultural norms and social norms in Spain play. Like because in Australia, we don't really have, especially in our carceral systems, any enculturation and thinking about rights and things like that. So I'm wondering if, like, I don't know, these ideas of social support being part of duties as a normative, has some kind of normative basis, or if most of it is practical, or if there's something about local cultures in Spain that make people more likely to feel a sense of moral duty to people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think that I understood you. So in Spain, there's a lot of, it's given a lot of importance to the issue of prisoner rights. And so we have one of the more progressive penitentiary laws due to the context in which it was created, which was right after the dictatorship we had in Spain. So it's a lot of importance it's given to prisoners' rights and also to treatment and rehabilitation. But like, as the way it's built, the two main concepts are regime, which is related to keeping order, and treatment, which is related to this assistance, or related to rehabilitation. But we have staff specific for this treatment goal. So prison officers are the ones who have the task of keeping order. So for them, their main task is to keep order and to make sure that the wing runs smoothly. So these the only things that they have the duty to do, like are their basic obligations are just processing the bureaucratic requests and make sure that the routine goes on every day. So they don't have to spend time speaking with inmates. They don't have to open the cell to them after they have left, because it's not in the prison rules. So all these little things that they can do that if they want. So I think that their approach, even if rights have a lot of importance in the Spanish legislation, their approach to providing this support is mainly practical, or also because due to the contact they have with inmates. So the ones that showed what they call institutional empathy, it's because they got to know inmates, so they got to understand their situation and the deprivation. So this moral also plays a role here, but it's mainly practical. It's not because they are obliged to, and they make sure that they made sure that I knew that, and also they make sure that inmates know that, like, they are helping them because they want to. And I think that this emphasis is very important because it's what gives them also power over inmates when talking about this instrumental control over them. So well, I'm not sure that I completely answered your question, but more or less this would be the I don't know if it was clear enough.
I think that satisfies, that answer. Thank you. Any other questions? Did you,
Thanks for the talk. My question kind of leads on from the last question, and whether you see there being any risk for social support to be linked to a means of controlling the detained population, for there to be an abuse of power or corruption if it's not kind of really entrenched in a rights-based or like kind of care framework.
Yeah, so that's one of the of the main controversial issues with this topic, I think, especially when social support is used as a way of control, which I think that it's what happens in most cases. But and in fact, there's some research also on this topic in Norway, if I remember it correctly, about how they talk about ruling by favors, like it's only it's not just coercion, but conditioning some rights to, or some help to order. But talking about, I was talking before, like, basic rights are granted in Spanish prisons, regardless if you behave or not, such as food and these kinds of things. Family visits, for example, they don't depend on how you behave, these kinds of issues. So it could be more about the little things that shape your experience of domestic life within the prison. So, as I said, they don't have control. Once they left the prison in Spain, inmates spend most of their time during the day out of the cell. So if they want to return, they can't. They are not allowed to do that. They don't have this right, but they can if prison officers allow them to. So it's this these little things, like getting the prison officers help to skip a bureaucratic procedure that would take 2 or 3 days to solve an issue. So it's these kinds of things. So I don't think that, even if obviously there's a problem here, that the fact that help is conditioned on behavior, and also because it can lead also to discrimination, as I was saying before, if for example, ethnic minorities don't reach officers for help. But I think that it doesn't compromise basic rights of inmates. So in this sense, I think it's kind of, well, it's not as bad as it could be. That's all I can say in the matter, but I'm aware that that's one of the big problems with this issue.
thank you, Cristina. We might move on to our next speaker, and then if we have more questions, we'll see if we have time at the end. So our final speaker is Bronte Alexander, who will be speaking on care, comfort and control, migrant mobilities in military humanitarian spaces. Take it away, Bronte.
Hi everyone, sorry, just getting organized here. Okay. Sorry, I'm just gonna close this entire like trucks going by. Okay, just give me a sec here. Thanks to the other speakers, it's been really great so far, and I can see a lot of crossovers as well in our research. So before I begin, I just want to quickly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from where I'm zooming in today. So it's the people of the Ugambe language region whose land and sovereignty has never been ceded. And I also want to extend that to the Indigenous peoples whose land I did this field work on in northern Brazil, as well as the many Indigenous Venezuelans, including the Warao people who have traveled and migrated through that region as well. So what I'm presenting today is kind of paper in progress, some ideas that I've been kind of pulling from my PhD research that I did in Brazil late 2019, so pre-pandemic. So just some ideas that I think I'd like to tease out a little bit more. So a little bit of background first. I'm looking at Brazil's response to recent Venezuelan migration through the shared land border in the northern state of Roraima. So in 2017, Brazil launched a federal humanitarian task force termed Operação Acolhida, or Operation Welcome. And this is led by the state, and it relies on several departments, including heavily on the Ministry of Defense, as well as other major international humanitarian organizations like UNHCR and IOM. So I'm focusing mainly on the response to those who have crossed the border and been processed as temporary migrants or as refugees, and also a bit of focus on those who are desabrigado, which is those who are living without adequate shelter. So today I'm looking at two sites of humanitarian care, one at the border and one at, in the capital city. And these sites really exemplify some of the ways in which migrant mobilities are sought to be managed and controlled. So this paper is investigating carceral practices of care that weaponize comfort in the management of migrant mobility. And I do this mainly by thinking of something, sorry, I can hear myself talking, so hopefully you can hear me okay. I don't know. But sometimes I can hear myself. Anyway, so I'm kind of looking at this by thinking about something quite mundane, which is sort of the weather. So the state of Roraima is really close to the equator. It's notorious for the high temperatures and monsoon rains, and the significance of this will kind of become clearer as I move through. So I'm working through a frame of critical humanitarianism, drawing on ideas of carceral humanitarianism and infrastructures of containment. And I'm arguing that comfort works to reproduce differential mobilities. So kind of highlighting how mobility management is restrictive even after Venezuelans have entered the country through regular routes. And this really reveals a wider mobility system in which the mobilities of humanitarian staff and military personnel are really favored over the movements of those staying within these sites. And we kind of see then that carceral geographies extend sort of beyond those detention camps and into everyday spaces of humanitarian care. So a quick overview of the spaces of where I'm looking at. So both of the sites are located in the very northern tip of Brazil in the state of Roraima, and you can hopefully see from the map that it's pretty isolated from the rest of Brazil. So we've got one site here right on the border in Pacaraima, and the other site just 200 kilometers south in the capital of Boa Vista. And I think what's important to note is that the spaces I'm looking at are not framed as sites of confinement or detention or punishment, but they really are constructed as humanitarian spaces of care that were built in response to growing homelessness amongst migrants in the state of Roraima. But despite this kind of intention, the management and operation of these sites really replicate institutional refugee camps. They evoke a sense of anonymity and sterility that, as we know, is very typical for emergency design and, of course, for the purpose of order and supervision. So as others have argued, humanitarian spaces, such as the ones that I'm looking at today, they've become kind of semi or quasi-carceral spaces. They use, mobility control practices, spatial designs, walls, fences, security barriers, surveillance, military patrols, these things that are often found in those geographies of detention and confinement. So the first site I'm looking at is the BV8 Transit Center. So this is located right at the border in Pacaraima, and it's next to the Petrigi, which is the triage center. And this site is managed by the Operation Welcome Task Force, and that's in partnership with UNHCR and other humanitarian agencies. And for security, that's provided by the military. Now, this is a temporary dormitory, so people can stay for up to 15 days maximum, and it can accommodate 1,000 people. So you can see the facilities here. There are these 3 very large shared tents. There's a communal area, the showers and toilets made from repurposed shipping containers, and sinks to do laundry in. Now, because of my kind of lack of photography, I'm going to just share a very quick excerpt from some of my reflections in my journal, just to give a bit of a sense of the space here. So I write, "We approach the metal barricades of the entrance and get checked in by the 2 army officers on duty. The heat feels overwhelming, and as we walk, the small grey stones beneath our shoes crunch and shift unevenly with every step. Moving past the empty communal area in the center of the site, I see people sitting in the shadows created by the large tents, likely seeking some minimal reprieve from the unforgiving temperature. When we finish the tour, we drop into one of the humanitarian agency's offices on site, situated near the entrance. As the door opens, a rush of cold air escapes, and we step into the comfort of the air-conditioned room." So we can kind of already start to see these themes of comfort, in relation to weather sort of emerging here. So now the second site I'm looking at is the rodoviária. So this is an overnight dormitory. It's located in the capital of Boa Vista, and it's situated just behind the international bus station. And that's just the translation of rodoviária, just means bus station. So this space actually used to be an improvised shelter created by incoming Venezuelans. But 2017, military kind of comes in, shuts it all down. Oh no, I've gone back one. Oh no, I've gone forward. There we go. Shuts it all down. Here we go. And all the people that were staying there were relocated, and the site was actually rebuilt, reconstructed. And this kind of marks the transformation here from informal urban space to an institutional site with top-down governance. So the rodoviária is managed by the local municipality and the Operation Welcome Task Force. And again, you've got the military serving for security. So this accommodation is overnight only, first come, first served basis. So people will take their belongings with them when they go. And again, it can accommodate about 1,000 people. So facilities, hopefully, as you can see, it's a little bit small there, but slightly different. So we've got different size tents here. On the right-hand side of the image, you can see these small army-colored tents. They're meant to be single-person tents for 1 person, but usually there'll be 2 people or even 2 people plus a child. On the left-hand side, you can see, hopefully, a little bit of those slightly bigger orange tents. So these are family tents, again, about 4 to 6 people meant to be in those tents, but usually about 2 families in there. And then in the very back, you can hopefully see, I don't know how big it is on that screen, just slightly larger tents. So there's a few slightly larger tents there that are reserved for categorically vulnerable people. And on site as well, you've got portable toilets and lockers to store bags overnight. So I'll just read another one of those quick excerpts, again, just to try to paint a picture, if I can, about the site. So I say, by the time we arrive, the mid-morning sun is beating down on us as we follow the fence boundary towards what looks like white sails covering a cluster of tents. The dust of the dry season forms a layer of dirt over the road, and the unevenness of the ground makes me wonder how the puddles must form in the wet season. Rows and rows of densely packed army tents line the area, creating the impression of a sea of green camouflage fixed to heavy concrete floor. From where I stand, I can't see where the tents end and the road begins again. There is a strange sense of being cramped and contained, and yet unbounded by the vastness of the space. So now that we've kind of introduced those two sites, I want to start by considering this aspect of comfort here. And I want to do that by very quickly just talking about the army base that's located at the border, so back at the border here. So you can see on the map, the army base is located on the other side of the triage center. It's reserved for military, government, humanitarian personnel. It's for accommodation, offices, and storing supplies. Now, in stark contrast to the BV-8 and the rodoviária, the Brazilian army base feels semi-suburban. There's this kind of like lush, well-maintained lawn. And there's these neat rows of small dwellings with air-conditioned rooms and colorful pot plants and flowers out the front of each door. Now, while all three of these sites are kind of organized uniformly, the organization of the army base emerges alongside a sense of comfort rather than sterility. And, you know, we know this is not uncommon, right? So I was talking to UNHCR leader for security while I was in Brazil. You know, they confirm, yes, army bases all over the world, you know, they try to create a sense of comfort during times of crisis. But you know, this comfort was not reflected in the spatialities of those other dormitories. And the conflicting spatialities of these sites, to me, signal a tension between humanitarian care, comfort, and control. And now, you know, we might argue that the design of the dormitories, you know, they reflect a lack of funding towards perhaps the cost of electricity, or maybe limited available resources that could enable long-term solutions. But, you know, given the resources allocated to the army base and the response at large, it kind of also reflects these rationalities of military humanitarian governance, which decides who is provided care and who has that access to comfort. So by looking at these sites, we can see that a logic of prevention through deterrence emerges. And this really highlights what I think is called like a weaponization of comfort. So just a very brief example from another shelter in the same state, humanitarian staff had assembled these sails above the shelter. And this was kind of in an effort to reduce the heat from the sun and provide some protection from those heavy rains. But soon after, you know, army personnel were instructed to come in and remove the sails. And the claim was that migrants would become too comfortable and they would end up staying in the shelter for longer. Now, the sites I'm looking at are temporary in nature. So deterrence here is not necessarily about staying, you know, stopping them from staying in the long term. But the logic, you know, does signal this deliberate act of deterring migrants from becoming too comfortable. It's sort of a, you know, a deterrence through discomfort. And this makes me think of infrastructures of containment that, you know, instead of barring or stopping mobility altogether, you know, these infrastructures seek to alter and to disrupt autonomous movement. And kind of further to that, it signals this reproduction of the division between military humanitarian personnel and Venezuelan recipients of aid. And I think that there's this kind of like unsettling banality that emerges from these acts of discomfort, right? So one that kind of emerges from maybe the draw to govern in the most efficient way possible. And although, you know, it might be seemingly obvious, you know, finding reprieve from this, you know, oppressive heat and these monsoon rains, it becomes a daily task for migrants and refugees, you know, who are navigating this in these humanitarian spaces of care. But this task, you know, stretches beyond those days within these sites. And that's particularly so for Venezuelans without access to adequate housing throughout the state of Roraima. So this discomfort kind of comes to permeate the lived experiences of Venezuelan refugees and migrants who are unable to rent or perhaps relocate elsewhere. Now, just to kind of, almost there, just to kind of close it off, I want to quickly consider the implications of care, comfort, and control in managing these migrant mobilities. So it's not only the case that every aspect of life in these military humanitarian spaces are kept in custody and managed through top-down governance, but also Venezuelans are faced with quasi-carceral spatialities of surveillance and control, as seen with the layout in both of these sites, as well as those military patrols and those entry and exit controls. And this kind of brings us to Kelly Oliver's carceral humanitarianism, where we see that spatial infrastructures of these sites respond to the construction of Venezuelan immigrants as both subjects of humanitarianism in need of protection and as part of a continuum of tricky subjectivities related to criminal activity. So the spatialities of these sites highlight the ways in which autonomous migrant mobilities are contained, disrupted, and controlled, even within, or especially within, these humanitarian spaces of care. So, oh, one more. As I've shown, you know, I think comfort really does play an important role in the management of migrant mobility. And not only does deterrence operate through discomfort, but this discomfort really works to reinforce those differential mobilities, favoring that of military humanitarian agents responsible for the management of these sites. And it reminds us of the humanitarian logic of keeping the aid recipient distant or providing care to others who are not quite regarded as equal. And, you know, this upholds those uneven power relations between those delivering care and those receiving it. And it kind of asks us, I think, to consider this element of comfort in the care and control nexus of humanitarian border work. Thank you. Be done.
Thank you so much, Bronte. That was great. Yeah, so fascinating to hear how care or lack of care, comfort and lack of comfort can kind of be used, yeah, to mobilize, immobilize. Are there any questions for Bronte in the room? Okay, I'll sorry, I just thought it was really good. Gabby said she just thought it was really good.
Love it, thanks.
I guess I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your methods. Like, obviously you went there and you were able to access those sites, which I guess I was a little surprised, you know, that like, can you tell us about that process? And did you speak to people there? Was it more observation? Yeah, tell us about the access and what you did when you were there.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, it was definitely a process. So I actually was volunteering with a local civil society group, and they were delivering hygiene-related products and support to these Venezuelan refugees and migrants without adequate housing. So that was kind of not my way in, but yes, I suppose that's what gave me access to these sites. So I was able to visit them with those groups who were often there conducting surveys to see how people were, you know, responding to their support and their assistance. And kind of, you know, the other side of that is this idea of spatial ethnography. So that's, I get that from Annette May Kim in Ho Chi Minh City. It's really fascinating approach, which kind of, it sort of looks at the study of space and geography, but it really tries to ground it and try to say, you know, well, we have to consider the power relations and the people who are in those spaces and how those spaces are managed and governed, rather than kind of seeing them as separate things. So yeah, so when I was there, I was also just paying extra attention to kind of those spatial aspects, a bit of the architecture, design, as well as speaking to different people. So the majority of people I spoke to, I mean, there's so many different people, but yeah, like humanitarian staff and military personnel, local residents as well, to gauge their response to the whole thing. And I did speak with plenty of Venezuelan refugees and migrants. Most of them, however, were not those who were the ones living without adequate housing. Unfortunately, that was something that I just kind of ethically, I suppose, it was sort of difficult to approach in what I think would be like a give and take kind of, without just sort of going in and taking information from this already sort of marginalized group. So I did talk to a lot of Venezuelans themselves, but not specifically those living without adequate housing.
Well, thanks. That's maybe I'm just projecting my own research interest, but it sounds a bit like new materialist as well, thinking about how the material and the human or discursive combine. So yeah, thanks for that. I can see Julienne online you have your hand raised. Do you want to go ahead?
Thank you so much also, Bronte, for this fascinating presentation. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about, I mean, I don't know how long people tend to linger in these spaces, right? In and around these spaces. And if there's anything you could say about what kind of carceral subjectivities or kind of the notions around becoming a citizen of a new country, or this in-betweenness, or so kind of what the subjective experience of that particular space is in relation perhaps to citizenship regimes or this kind of issue.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll try. So it's actually a really interesting setting, I think, or context, because Brazil, as being part of Latin America, is one of the few countries that has signed the Cartagena Declaration, which recognizes an expanded definition of refugees. So I think there's a sense of like contested refugeedom here, where Venezuelans might not actually be considered refugees in other parts of the world, whereas here they have that category for attaining a visa. So there's definitely, I think, something to be said here of being able to on the one hand be kind of granted access to being a refugee status of refugee, but then on the and then having access to this humanitarian care. I mean, there were like 50 UNHCR workers there, like it was like a big operation, so on the one hand there's this, but then on the other hand it's kind of like, well, if you think about the sort of political context that this was unfolding under right-wing Bolsonaro, and kind of these other political motives in here. So I'm going off on a tangent now, but yeah, I think there's definitely something interesting there. And I mean, in my own work, in terms of like subjectivities, I explored a little bit about those kinds of different intersections that people are at. So in what I've presented today, it seems kind of almost binary. I say like military and humanitarian personnel versus Venezuelan migrants and refugees, but that's not really the case. It's much more complex than that. A lot of, if not most of the humanitarian workers that I volunteered with were actually Venezuelans themselves, and they themselves were at their own different intersections. So there was intersections of class, as well as gender and sexuality was quite big as well. That came up in my research. So I don't know if I've answered anything specifically, but it's definitely complicated, and yeah, quite interesting as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julienne.
Thanks for that. And if there aren't any questions in the room, then I can see Cristina also has your hand raised. So we might make this the final question for the session. Go for it, Cristina.
Okay, so it's first a very short question and then something that maybe you have not looked at in your search, but I was curious about that. So first, it's a question about, it's the military personnel in Brazil in charge of border control, or are they, why are they there in these refugees camps? And then if you got to talk to them, I wanted to know if you could see, or if you explored to some extent how they understand, or if they have conflicting feelings between these ideas of custody or border control and humanitarian care. So I don't know if you have some insights in that.
Yeah. Thanks, Cristina. Actually, both of you, when you were speaking, I was like, I want to message you about other things, because I was really interested, Cristina, in your work in terms of unveiling or kind of uncovering the individual, in your case, prison officers, like their experiences and their viewpoints. I think that is really important work, and I think it can be replicated elsewhere. And I wrote notes when you were talking about that. So first, to answer your question, yes, the military is there in terms of border control. So they're there to securitize the border. I think there was something like 500 or 700 military personnel deployed to this very small state in Roraima during this operation. Before that, the border was relatively open. There's a lot of circular migration between Venezuela and Brazil. And the kind of second part is, I remember speaking to this military colonel, about her work. And, oh, sorry, that's my phone on my computer. I don't know how to turn that off, sorry. And anyway, when I was talking to her, she was adamant that she was doing her response, her duty for love. Like, her whole thing was that it came from love, it came from care, it came from a willingness of, the Brazilian people. She said, regardless of the government and, the kind of political environment, this was her feeling, was that it was, this sense of, needing to care for those people. And I did find that interesting. I haven't kind of gone down that path to explore that any further. That's why when you were speaking, Cristina, I was very interested in that, because whether or not that's the case, or whether or not it's, a bit of both, yes, it's from this sense of compassion, this kind of humanitarian drive or moral for compassion. If it's that, or if it's that as well as, what you were talking about, seeking order. And in this case, probably the same, I think it doesn't have to be black and white. I think these are humans responding, in their own ways to what they think is helpful. And I think I do want to kind of add into this. I feel like I do also have a responsibility to say that there are some really good things being done. Like, obviously my work, as a critical geographer, is to kind of pull it apart and pick out all of those things that really need attention, and kind of perpetrate violence. But unlike a lot of humanitarian responses or military interventions, there is a lot of good work coming out of this as well. I'll leave that there.
All right, well, thank you everyone for your presentations. They were all really great and stimulating, and it sounds like you all have a lot of things that you could later reach out to each other about, which is really nice. Please, join me in thanking our presenters.
Well done.
And we'll end the session then. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.